of business and the professions. And BACFI represents the interest of employed and non-practicing barristers providing legal services in commerce, finance and industry, the CFI bar. As most of our guests are students, it also, as you know, welcomes student members who are interested in a career outside of chambers. We can't really welcome everybody with a clap because we're in a webinar, but a really big welcome to our speakers today. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from the panel on their views on what it takes to succeed at the employed bar. And it's always very exciting to speak to students after this event, because before the event, it's not something that's necessarily come into their horizon, and afterwards they're normally extremely excited to talk about what they've heard at the event. So we're very much looking forward to this. And I'm going to welcome our speakers before I hand over to Daniel Byrne. Apologies if I've not pronounced your name correctly. So firstly, in order of how the speakers are presented to you, although I appreciate that they may choose a different order, I'm just going to very quickly run through some rules for webinars. I know that we've all been doing this for some time, but because this is a Teams meeting rather than a webinar, please do switch off your microphones if you are not speaking, because there will be an echo going through the room. Unless a speaker invites questions at the end of their section, please do wait until the end. We do have a chat function here, which is available, so you can put questions in the chat, but can I ask you please not to interrupt the speakers with questions unless they invite questions at the end of their section. And if there is time for questions, which we hope that there will be at the end, then perhaps that can be dealt with then. So that would be very helpful if you could do that. But all along the way, do pop your questions in the chat. So Daniel is a partner at AA Thornton and Company, and also a deputy district judge. Patrick Rappo is a partner at DLA Piper. Alexandra Carr is formerly of HSBC, and I'm sure she'll tell you what she's doing now. And then Ryan Porter is from Lloyds Bank. Jack Meek is from the UK Home Office, so is no doubt having a very busy time at the moment, as is no doubt Janet. And I'm, again, apologies if I don't pronounce your name correctly. Manane, is that right? You're going to tell me?
It's Manan, actually, but don't worry. I'm well used to nobody being able to pronounce it correctly. Don't worry.
Thank you. So really, thank you very much for coming, and we very much look forward to hearing the talk. So over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Fionn. And yes, it's Dan Byrne, so that's correct. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sort of essentially going to try and keep things running and chair the meeting, but obviously my fellow panel members will have a lot of input to give and a lot of experience to draw upon, and to hopefully illustrate some of the different ways that you can be an employed barrister. Just one thing, by way of reminder, this meeting is being recorded. There may have been a little pop-up, just wanted to mention that so that everyone is aware. And I think, as Fionn said, just please mute yourself if you're not actually speaking in order to prevent any echoes or sort of other interruptions. So I think the first thing I have to do is probably just very quickly explain what an employed barrister is, and then I'm going to go on and tell you a little bit more about myself, and hopefully just quickly run through some of the basic bios of our panel. So therefore expanding a little bit on what Fionn's already said. I'll do that sort of all the way through. Then I'll invite panel members to basically give a bit more of an insight into their everyday working careers, the sort of thing they might be doing on a day-to-day basis, which I think will show that there's quite a lot of difference in the sorts of careers that you can have as an employed barrister. I may also ask them tell us about their most fun or memorable moment in their professional lives, because I think could be a bit of fun for us all. So we'll see where that takes us. And obviously they'll all be available to answer questions probably towards the end, I think, unless anybody feels otherwise as we go along. Also, thank you to City Law School for having us today. It's great that people are interested in taking time out of their evening to come along and have a listen and to engage. So just very quickly on the first point, what is an employed barrister? Well, I'm sure you all know that there are essentially two sort of professional strands of lawyer in the UK. That is a solicitor and a barrister. The routes to qualification are a little bit different. Ever evolving actually, but generally speaking, the solicitor route involves a slightly different vocational course followed by a 2-year training contract in a firm, whereas becoming a barrister involves a 1-year pupillage in a chambers of self-employed barristers prior to then being qualified as a barrister, whereupon you might either join a chambers as a self-employed individual, cooperating with other members of chambers in that way, sharing costs, but sometimes being against each other. And that role, sorry, just a reminder, I think someone's just joined, but just a reminder to mute yourself if you're on, if you're not speaking, just to avoid interruptions. Thank you. And the self-employed role tends to be very much an advocate in court role. I think that's sort of typically what those barristers do. But there is also the option once you've qualified, and I should say you can do pupillages in other organisations now as well. Once you've qualified, you can also become an employed barrister. So that is the distinction there, is you're not a self-employed barrister. You are working for an organisation rather than for yourself. And there's lots of different organisations that you can work for in that role, obviously all with a legal element, but you can probably appreciate that the variety of sort of roles that you can take there are probably greater actually than the self-employed bar in terms of being connected to a business. So that's just a sort of very brief rundown of the sort of major differences, because what we're talking about today is the opportunities to be an employed barrister and sort of how that can look once you've got there. So everyone's probably come about to that position through different routes. What we all share is that we are all still barristers, so we're all called to the bar in the same way that self-employed barristers are. Some of us may have even practiced as a self-employed barrister for a while. Others practice at the employed bar and then go back to self-employment. So just to sort of also reiterate that there can be a bit of a sort of blurring or a crossing of lines there as well. But we're mainly here to talk about what it's like being an employed barrister. So just quickly run through the bios. Obviously, people can say a bit more about their own circumstances and how they ended up where they ended up once I open up the panel to give their insights. But just very briefly, just so everyone knows a bit more about where people have come from. I myself qualified as a well, my first degree was as a scientist, effectively, it's biological sciences. I then did the conversion course actually at City to get the legal academic qualifications. I then did the BVC, as it was then called, at BPP, which is the barrister kind of vocational qualification. It was then called the BPTC. It may have even changed its name again since then. Then I obtained a pupillage at a specialist intellectual property chambers called Hogarth in London, and following that year, as it happens, I did not obtain a tenancy at that chambers. So I then moved on to a different chambers where I did what was called a third six, because these pupillages are actually 6-month periods, so it was a third six, and it was during that time that I sort of felt I had a bit of a choice to make about whether I did stay at the self-employed bar or look for other opportunities. And the reason the choice was difficult for me was because I did want to do the advocacy, but I also wanted to work in intellectual property, and there just weren't the opportunities there at that time. So it was either stick with the advocacy but don't do intellectual property at the bar, or essentially lose the advocacy, if you like, to some degree, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, as a topic of conversation, and focus on the subject matter of intellectual property, which is what I did. Hence, I ended up in a law firm. And I moved around a few law firms, and I'm now a partner at AA Thornton, which is an IP boutique law firm in London. So that's essentially my bio. We can get on to any insights people want to hear in a bit, but I'm just going to introduce the others. Janet, currently working as a Crown prosecutor at the CPS. Now, her bio probably tells too much in a sense. I don't want to give away some of the exciting things that she's going to talk about, but originally it appears that she was a tax accountant for a number of years at various banks and organizations, and actually following leaving that profession, seeking something more exciting, it appears that she went to Imperial Healthcare Trust and ran a charity within Charing Cross Hospital and trained there as a mediator, which I think is going to be fascinating to hear about, and then studied part-time to do her GDL and got called to the bar in 2012, age 47, and then transitioned into the employed role, which sees her now as a Crown prosecutor. So there's going to be a lot to get into there, and obviously fascinating day to day we'd like to hear about as well, but we'll come on to that in a minute. Ryan Porter, welcome Ryan. Ryan's at Lloyd's, and the bio he's given me says that he was called to the bar in 1999, and he works in financial market contracts and regulation. Prior to entering the city in that role, he completed a pupillage at a leading banking law set, that is to say a chambers of self-employed barristers, after a period of lecturing on English contract law at the University of Warsaw. So again, some very interesting background leading to his current role. So obviously we'd like to hear about that, please, Ryan, in a minute. Jack Meek, welcome Jack, at the Government Legal Department, and is currently at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and is a Bar Council social mobility advocate for 2021-2022. So yeah, thanks Jack, look forward to hearing a bit more about your story in a moment. Alexandria Carr. Now, this is where I think she was introduced as being at HSBC, or formerly of HSBC, and that's certainly correct according to the bio that I've been given. But in fact, she left HSBC in 2022 to become a consultant, and I think has possibly even moved on a bit since then. So this bio might already be out of date, but Alex will probably tell us a bit more. But prior to all of that, she was called to the bar by Inner Temple in '97, and she also had a period of time at the Government Legal Service, including the Treasury Solicitors Department, the Ministry of Defence, and HM Treasury. She joined a US law firm after that and practiced in London in a financial service regulatory and enforcement group, and then ended up in HSBC, as already mentioned, as Deputy General Counsel for Wealth Management, and then following that, Head of European Regulatory Change. So again, a fascinating story there that we'd all like to hear a bit more about, please, Alex. And last but not least, of course, Patrick Rappo, who we've heard is a partner at DLA Piper. He focuses on a range of corporate and white-collar crime matters, so that's including things like international bribery, corruption, money laundering, fraud and sanctions issues, representing both companies and individuals. He's been involved in a number of high-profile investigations and prosecutions, including Global Investigation Review's most important case of 2020. So I don't know if that's going to be the highlight you speak about, Patrick, but it sounds interesting. Apparently, he also advises on audits, so I assume that's with a view to avoiding any of these sorts of sanctions or issues arising out of these quite exciting sounding things like bribery and corruption, and also advises international governments on, for example, their anti-money laundering regimes. So it sounds like Patrick's expertise is in quite a lot of demand. He was previously at the Serious Fraud Office as joint head of the Bribery and Corruption Division, and has a lot of experience in the world of business and corporate self-reporting, and is the SFO's point of contact for all such reports. So there's a lot of interesting things that Patrick can tell us. So that's just a brief run through, and no doubt each of you listening will have been making notes and thinking about the questions you want to ask people, depending on your particular interests. So hopefully there's something for everybody there. I mean, I'll move on to Janet in just a second. Worth just saying, perhaps from my point of view, my day-to-day is very much like that of a solicitor. So there is an element of an employed barrister's life which can be very much like that of a solicitor if you want it to be. So I work in a law firm. I do the work that's sort of behind the advocates in court, so preparing for trial and all that sort of thing. So I'm a litigator, which probably makes sense. Interestingly, employed barristers, if they're doing that, need to get a special dispensation to allow them to do what's called conduct litigation. So that's on my practicing certificate, because otherwise self-employed barristers aren't allowed to do that, and that's where there is a distinction between the different strands of the profession. So essentially, I tell my clients to consider me to be a solicitor, just a slightly more glamorous solicitor, but otherwise that is probably the best way to think of me. So I'm very happy to answer any questions later on about that. But that is sort of where I fit, albeit in the very wonderful world of intellectual property litigation. So that's probably enough from me. Handing over to Janet, please. Janet, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you came to be where you are, and sort of any interesting insights you've had along the way, a bit about your day-to-day working life now, and any memorable sort of highlights that you can share with us.
Thanks so much, Dan. It made me sound quite interesting, and I feel now doomed to fail. As you've heard from Dan, I'm currently working as a Crown Prosecutor for the Crown Prosecution Service in London, and I work in the Magistrates' Courts. And the way it's organised is that you're allocated specific courts, and my courts are Croydon, Wimbledon and Bromley. And at the moment, I'm on my feet in it's called the Guilty Anticipated Plea Court, which is the GAP Court, and the Not Guilty Anticipated Plea Court, which is called the NGAP Court. And it means that in the GAP Court, I give the bench the full facts of each case, the details of the defendants' antecedents, and then advise on sentencing and apply for relevant orders. So things like sexual harm prevention orders or restraining orders. And in the NGAP court, I deal with the allocation of the case, because obviously the idea of the NGAP court is to take a plea and then decide where the case is going to be heard. So I deal with any applications in relation to that. For example, bad character, special measures, and then I make sure that the preparation for effective trial, or the PET form, is completed and a date set for the trial. And then I make sure I give clear instructions to the police or the reviewing lawyers about disclosure, witnesses, and any other element that may assist in the smooth running of the case. I thought I'd start a bit by giving a bit of an idea of what the CPS actually is. It's the primary prosecuting agency in the UK, and it employs caseworkers and reviewing lawyers who prepare cases and the lawyers who present cases, and they're known as the Crown Advocates. And the CPS is led by Max Hill KC, who is the current Director of Public Prosecutions, and he reports to the Attorney General, who is Michael Ellis KC MP. But obviously, with the way things are going, that may change quite imminently. The CPS is split into geographical areas. There are some specialist divisions, for example, Serious Economic and Organised Crime and International Division, and CPS Proceeds of Crime Division, which in fact I started working at when I joined the CPS. And in each area, divisions have a Chief Crown Prosecutor, and they're supported by Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutors. And then there's a senior management level, and then a level of Crown Prosecutors, Senior Crown Prosecutors and Specialist Prosecutors. And prosecutors tend to work in the Magistrates' Court and as reviewing lawyers throughout the CPS, and the Crown Advocates work as counsel in the Crown Courts. Now, just a bit about me, which obviously is, for me, is going to be the dullest bit. I joined the CPS in 2020 as a tax accountant. I was working within the Proceeds of Crime Division, which meant that I was dealing with financial statements that were coming in from financial investigators in relation to asset recovery. And I previously qualified as an accountant at Ernst & Young, and I worked also in financial control at the Swiss Bank and Deutsche Bank in the city. But to be brutally honest, I was not a very good accountant. So I thought about a career change. And that's how I ended up at Imperial Healthcare Trust, working in charity governance and running a charity in the hospital. And I don't know why. I think it must be that I went grey very early, but I was asked to join the mediation board and train as a mediator because I looked measured, but I've never really felt myself to be a measured person. And having been involved in that and dispute resolution, I really got an interest in training as a lawyer. And so I I also did my BPTC at City and was called to the bar in 2012. And in fact, when I joined CPS Proceeds of Crime in 2015, I'd largely given up on ever obtaining a pupillage. I think I applied every year from about 2010 to 2015. And then when I hit 50, I decided that I really didn't want to put myself through that agony ever again. So, and I enjoyed working in CPS POC very much and spent my time reviewing pretty interesting cases and getting some very satisfactory results from confiscation. So just a bit about the CPS as a place to work. It's got a very inclusive environment and professional development is taken very seriously. When I was in CPS POC, my line manager was very hands-on, but not in the micromanager way that we all don't really like. She just wanted to make sure that I had adequate training and realistic development, and I was interested and cared about my work. And she gave me plenty of opportunities that were outside my day-to-day role and made sure that I was sufficiently challenged in everything that I did. And the CPS has a programme for legal trainees, which it advertises every March for a start in September. And when the advert came out in March 2021, my line manager arranged a meeting with me, and I thought, oh, God, what have I done wrong now? But really, she just wanted to speak to me about applying for the trainee scheme. I really felt that at my age, I was beyond it. But I think that does show how inclusive the CPS is. And obviously, I was very apprehensive because however much we try to put things into the back of our minds, the Chamber's application failures came flooding back to me. But I took her advice and I applied. The actual application process is not complicated, but I would say it has many parts. It has an initial paper application and SIFT, a verbal reasoning and situational judgment test, which for somebody of my age I found incredibly challenging. There's a video interview, which is rather strange because you're given 3 questions and you have to answer them to a blank screen as if you're responding to humans. Then you give, if you get through that, you give a presentation on a subject that you're given 5 days before the interview. And mine was on investigating and prosecuting cybercrime. And I think if I could give you a tip on that, the subject that they tend to choose is usually fairly topical, and that was extremely topical last year. And then finally, there's the interview. And I have to be honest, the final assessment and interview took 2 hours, and I seriously had to lie down for a considerable period after it. But I think the most important thing to remember in the entire process is to be yourself, because you have a law degree and you've passed the bar exams, and clearly you have the intellect and skills in order to undertake the role. So the idea of the interview is to assess whether your personality actually fits the role. I was given pupillage in London South, and about 6 weeks before I started, I found out who my supervisor was, and he phoned me and we met for a chat, and he's absolutely lovely and we've become great friends, very caring, and even now he's interested in what I'm doing, and he's always available for me if I need to ask him anything. Pupillage is very conventional at CPS. It has a first and second six structure. And my particular scheme was organised by a district Crown prosecutor who was always available to answer questions and queries and offer any advice and encouragement and help out when things just didn't go according to plan. So it's a very, very supportive environment. So a bit about my actual pupillage. During my first 6, I spent 6 weeks on a placement to the Rape and Serious Sexual Offences Division, which is called RASO. I think you probably all know that. I spent a month at external chambers, and I was very lucky to go to Red Lion Court. And I spent the time with Jennifer Dempster, who's a KC, and she was defending James Watson in the Ricky Neve trial at the Old Bailey. So that was a very interesting case to be following. I spent some time marshalling, first with Her Honour Judge Kent at Kingston, and then with His Honour Judge Hotmire at Southwark. And I would say about marshalling, I think we're all in awe of judges, but I think if you approach them and ask them, my experience is that they're very interested to speak to students and to people who want to know about their day-to-day job. And I think also being on the bench is a rather lonely experience, and I think they quite like the company. And then I spent a month with a Crown Advocate observing in court. And then during my second 6, I went back to the same Crown Advocate for 2 months, and I was on my feet in the Crown Court doing bail hearings and committals for sentence, and then spent the rest of my second 6 in the Magistrates' Court, sharing courts with my supervisor. During my 14 months, I've also conducted a victim's right to review and assisted in an application to the Attorney General to appeal against an unduly lenient sentence. In terms of the reality of the CPS as opposed to what one hears in the media, one of the main criticisms against CPS pupillage is that it's prosecution based, but obviously it's going to be prosecution based because it's with the Crown Prosecution Service. But it doesn't mean that we're relentless in our prosecution and persecute defendants, and nor does it mean that prosecutors have no idea how to conduct a case for the defence. We prosecute the right person for the right offence and apply a very strict code to everything that's charged. The code comes in two parts, the evidential element and the public interest element, and I perform a charging review for every case that I undertake. To anyone I think in seek of pupillage, I would thoroughly recommend applying to the CPS. If you're interested, just type in CPS into your browser and the CPS website will tell you everything you need to know. Another tip is it's also a fantastic resource if you're in court, as its information pages cover every single aspect of criminal law. And the CPS offers an interesting, exciting career. The organisation is extremely inclusive and it's staffed by high calibre individuals who are definitely committed to the roles that they perform and extremely balanced in what they do. In London South, our Chief Crown Prosecutor is a barrister called Lionel Iden, and he is extremely approachable and very visible. And our three Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutors are equally approachable and available. I'm not definitely going to promise a relaxed and casual environment at the CPS, but all the advocates that I've met are driven by public service and will definitely go the extra mile to ensure that for both victims and defendants, justice is done. And it may involve very long days, which I've done myself, but at the end of every working day, I do feel that I've made a very worthwhile contribution to society. In terms of the funniest thing that has ever happened to me in my career, I suppose the thing that sticks in my mind is when before I obtained a pupillage, I did a mini pupillage at Red Lion Court with David Etherington. He was then QC, he's now KC. And it was a pretty harrowing case. It was a baby shaking case. And I arrived, it was at the Old Bailey. I arrived and met with David, and he discussed the case and told me about how serious it was and what his strategy was going to be. And then quite unexpectedly, the CPS, when we arrived in court, the CPS withdrew the case, and that happened at about 11:30. So I looked at David and thought, I wonder what we're going to be doing now, thinking that he would be going back to chambers to do some paperwork. And he said to me, Jan, I think I'm feeling a little bit peckish. Shall we go and get something to eat? So we stepped out of court and he hailed a taxi and we ended up at the Garrick Club. And I spent the rest of my first day of my mini pupillage at the Garrick Club with David Etherington. So that was a very nice introduction to the bar for me. That's all I have to say. So I'll hand back to Dan. And I just would like to wish all the students the very best of luck. I think looking at somebody with as much grey hair as me, having only recently qualified at the CPS, don't ever give up hope. And really, if you want to obtain pupillage, be dedicated and you will, and the very best of luck. Thanks so much, Dan.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Janet. That's very interesting. And I think really sort of makes the point of contrast between my own introduction there for myself, which is to say that I'm essentially a solicitor, not doing the oral advocacy, whereas you are clearly an advert for somebody who's standing up doing the oral advocacy. So I think that's very interesting to hear. Thank you. Obviously, a lot of information there. Phrases like on your feet and to the bench and all that sort of stuff, but all very good stuff. And I think certainly makes the point that it's a varied and interesting day job. One thing you said I thought was very interesting, that ensure your personality fits the role. I think that is very interesting, and obviously don't want to take that too far, but I think there is a degree of resilience and a certain personality that might be more suited for certain roles than others. But I think I would just add to that there are so many different roles available that it should be shut off to no one. You know, the option of being a barrister should not be closed to anyone. So hopefully that's what we can explore a bit today, and hopefully prove that by all the talks we're doing today. So thank you very much, Janet. Obviously, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll deal with them at the end, or obviously ask at the end with your video on. So next, handing over to Ryan, please. Thank you, Ryan. Ryan's obviously at Lloyds Bank, and just interested to hear about your journey, your day-to-day life, and any insights, memorable moments that you can share, please.
Well, hello everybody. Well, my journey to Lloyds Bank was quite a convoluted one, I'd say. Although I've been there now for 15 years, so I'm quite settled into the role. After university, as you said, I went to teach English law at Warsaw University just ahead of their joining the European Union. And this was to help their generation of young lawyers get an idea as to how that might interact with their own legal system. I very much enjoyed that experience and considered perhaps continuing in a sort of academic vein. But I had the benefit whilst in Poland to meet many senior lawyers who would come to visit the school. And they very much gave me the impression that you want to perhaps take some sort of private practice experience before deciding how you want your career really to pan out, and that was good advice. Whilst in Poland, I applied for not for pupillage, but for the year at the city law school, which was interesting. It's certainly very helpful to have been at Warsaw University, because this was seen to be doing a good thing, and it helped me to secure a scholarship from Inner Temple to deal with the fees of attending the City of London Law School. I enjoyed my time there and proceeded to a pupillage in a banking law set in Gray's Inn at 3 Rowland Buildings. And that was an interesting and challenging year. It's really your first experience of work and a sort of non-student and non-university based lifestyle. And it was a very friendly set with interesting work. And I discovered that I really quite liked banking, and it's doesn't involve a large amount of on-your-feet advocacy, certainly not at trial. They spend a lot of time doing pre-trial applications, and they develop quite a good skill in negotiating settlements. And those pre-court aspects of being a barrister, I thought were particularly interesting, and it contrasted really quite a lot with the black letter law that you learn at university and then were teaching. So there are many sort of personal skills that you need to become a barrister. And I suppose my advice to the students seeking pupillage is to realise that the people assessing you are looking at your academic record, but not that alone. And if you've been invited for an interview, they've probably made an assessment that from the evidence they've seen, you meet that academic bar. And so it's at an interview, it's probably not necessary to apologize for any missteps or failings, or for any grades you got on particular papers, because they'll have already made that assessment in the round, and they'll be, I think, more interested in assessing whether you're interested in the type of work that they do, whether you'll be hardworking, and whether you'll develop the non-academic skills that are necessary to become a good barrister. So I think people should go to those interviews confident that they certainly have a chance, because you're not invited to interview unless you have a chance. And so it's an opportunity to highlight and show off your other skills and elements of your personality. On a practical level, I think the best advice I received for pupillage interviews was to find a recent case in the area of law that the chambers specialise in, and have in your mind a good case summary of that judgment, so that if they ask you to talk about your interest in that area of the law, you can talk about this recent high profile, maybe a Court of Appeal or Supreme Court case. And that happened in my interviews. I remember talking about a contract law case which had gone to the House of Lords on the appropriate measurement of damages for breach of contract with a swimming pool. I think it was Roxy Electronics. And they can make an assessment of your ability to present arguments and your interest in their area of the law on the back of that. So that would be a tip I'm pleased to pass on. Like Dan, I failed to secure a tenancy at 3 Verulam buildings where I'd done my pupillage, but continued to a third six at a set of chambers in Lincoln's Inn, which involved a slight change of area of specialism because they were mainly a property law set. And I enjoyed my time there and enjoyed actually having the opportunity to do some advocacy, because the value of the cases, the set received more instructions on lower value cases, and I got the opportunity to go and attend county court and present cases and cross-examine witnesses, which was a valuable experience and sort of rounded out my legal training, I found. So I very much enjoyed my time there, but was rather missing the banking law element that I'd seen in my pupillage. And so I too was faced with a choice of whether to pursue the interest in banking law or to continue searching for tenancy in perhaps any area of civil law. And given that choice, I just saw in Lincoln's Inn, just outside Lincoln's Inn Library, an advert was put up by the person who became my first employee in the city, saying that they were looking for someone for their legal department. And that it was very informal. It was just a notice on a board. I followed it up. I met her. She too had been a barrister. She had been a criminal barrister in a chambers in Gray's Inn before joining the city maybe 20 years previously, and had built up the legal department at Credit Agricole. And so I felt that this was a worthwhile career path to pursue. And I joined her team and was happily there for 7 years before then moving to Lloyds Bank, where I've been since. I suppose in terms of an average day, what the work involves, it's not really like being a solicitor, because you've really only got one client. The legal department is a large one. All of the big banks have large legal departments subdivided into sections, and I'm in the team which helps provide legal support for the sales and trading floor, and in particular the derivative and foreign exchange traders. So you develop some sort of speciality in the products that they sell, and that's an important element of the job. And you help them to devise sales processes which will keep them on the right side of the law in terms of the various vitiating factors which could affect a contract. So you've got good evidence that there were no misrepresentations made, and that the parties had a equal knowledge, and there was a sort of equality of information for the contractual counterparty. That's when you're dealing with retail customers. Equally, you have to negotiate contractual terms on a more bespoke basis for various interbank transactions as well. And so a lot of the job is really making the business legally and regulatory compliant, and to protect them from the risk of future litigation. There is, of course, an element of which we fail to do that on occasion, and clients bring bring claims, which we then have to assess as to whether a product had been particularly missold to them or not. And there you work with colleagues to both assess their particular claim and the bank's processes which led to that. So you're very much in a collaborative environment working with professionals from other areas. Sales and trading team who deal directly with the customers, and a lot of other what are called middle office support functions who assess the business processes and approve, for example, the introduction of new products to be sold or changes in the way that a product is documented. So a lot of my time is spent on committees and discussing with colleagues the best ways to support the business from a legal perspective. We're also called upon often to give a sort of unbiased opinion in relation to disputes within the bank, between various departments, as to what would be the effect of certain changes and how best to implement or reflect new laws or new legislation. So you have a wide-ranging role, and you get to work with a wide variety of people with many different skills. From the marketing team preparing adverts to describe the bank's products, to the hard-nosed traders who want to know what will happen if a counterparty fails to post certain collateral within a certain time, and what options would be open to the bank to deal in that, to act in that situation. So I rather enjoy the range of work and the range of colleagues. The banks all have rather large legal departments. So there are over 300 lawyers at Lloyds. Unfortunately, they don't offer pupillages, which is a shame. Banks used to be able to do that, but when the rules were tightened up a few years ago, I think a lot of banks just fell out of that practice. And it's sometimes easier to qualify as a solicitor within a bank via schemes, because each of the banks has a panel of large solicitors firms that they work with, and therefore its ability to offer training contracts for solicitors is slightly easier, because we can lean upon those panel supplier firms for elements of the training contract which they can't achieve within the bank. Now I'm trying to think what else I should mention. That's an idea, I think, of what I do on a day-to-day basis and something of my background. I've also passed on the best tip I received for pupillage interviews. And I suppose memorable moments. One of the memorable moments during pupillage was going to collect a judgment from the House of Lords, which was an interesting experience. You have to do really almost nothing at all, but you do get presented into the House of Lords chamber. And what struck me was how many small microphones there were dangling from the ceiling. So it was like you were surrounded by almost a swarm of little bees, and I'd never noticed that or seen that before. So and the fact that the members of the House of Lords legal committee were not dressed in robes. So unlike all the other court appearances, they were in lounge suits, unlike the wigs and the gowns that I got used to seeing on a daily basis during pupillage. But that was quite an experience. Within banking, I suppose memorable moments would be around the time of the banking crisis, 2008 and 9, playing a role in determining the bank's response to redress programs which were going to be offered to the business and had to be approved by regulators and by third-party accountants. And that was a very high profile, very important set of decisions had to be made. You felt the weight of the responsibility, and the sums of money involved were very large. So yes, as part of that, I got to go and, as part of a delegation, present an assessment of how material the potential losses could be to the banking group, and that was quite a nerve-wracking moment.
Yeah, sounds quite intense. Gosh,
that was intense.
Head of the
dealing room spent we spent a week preparing for this afternoon's worth of a presentation.
Yes, I'm sure.
And I think that would be it. Also, the nice part is there's a company called ISDA which organises central documentation, which is used between the banks in documenting various derivative transactions, and they hold an annual general meeting. In one year it'll be in the Americas, and the other year it'll be in Europe. And the year it was in Prague, I went to attend, and you spend a day listening to discussions about future developments in documentation, and in the evenings you're lavishly entertained in grand buildings.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to cut you off there, because I think that's giving the wrong impression. Everyone's going to think you get to go to the Garrett Club and to international parties. So this is obviously
once in 15 years.
Okay, taking it. Yeah, people will be flocking to Lloyd's. Thank you very much, Ryan. Now, that's really interesting insight there. Very, I'd say probably industry specific towards the end there, but that obviously is of great interest to a lot of people. I thought your tip about a recent case for pupillage interviews was good. Made me slightly nervous, because that's sort of high stakes poker. If you've got to make sure you get that right if you're taking that sort of thing into the lion's den, where they literally were involved in it. But I like that idea. So to your point about collaborative environment as well, I think that's another thing which employed barristers often get over self-employed barristers. They get to work with a team of people. It's a bit less lonely, it's a bit less isolating. So that might be a theme that we pick up on in due course. So thank you very much for that. Right, without further ado, I think it's it's over to Jack, I think, next. So Jack, same sort of 3 questions for you, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. I hope everyone can hear me, because I'm getting a sort of light flickering on my camera every now and again, so I don't know how secure the connection is. But thanks very much for having me, and thank you to everyone who's attending. As you've been told, I'm Jack Meek. I'm a barrister at the Government Legal Department. Theon introduced me as being at the Home Office earlier on. I had previously advised as part of the government's commercial law group, and the main client was the Home Office, but I'm no longer there. I'll leave it for others to decide after today's news whether or not that's fortuitous. But I am now at the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So I will get on to speak about my own progression to the point I'm at shortly, but I thought it would be useful just to give a brief overview about GLD first, before turning to sort of my own reflections about my I hate using things like my journey or my story, but you get the general idea. And then just some thoughts on succeeding at the employed bar more generally. So if that sounds all right, I'll proceed on that basis. So unlike some of the other employed bar opportunities that you've heard about or will hear about, similarly to CPS, GLD does offer pupillage opportunities. So it's all under the banner of the Government Legal Department's legal trainee scheme. And if you're interested in this, whether before I said my piece or afterwards, it's relatively easy to find if you do a search for GLD legal trainee scheme online. And there are opportunities for both barristers and solicitors to train with government. So you can train either with GLD. There's then a commercial specific route within GLD. And then there are some opportunities at HMRC, National Crime Agency, and Competition and Markets Authority. On those sort of final 3, I'm not sure how wide the opportunities are for barristers. Some of them may be solicitor specific, but I do know that in my training year group, there was a pupil barrister at HMRC. So that's something to bear in mind as well, and gives a brief flavour of just how wide the government legal profession is as a legal service. And as I said, the unusual thing about training at the bar with government is the fact that it is a 2-year program. So the pupillage year is year 1 of that program. All barristers, and there's typically between about 4 to 6 pupil barristers in a wider group of perhaps 30 to 40 trainees, but all pupil barristers tend to go first and foremost to Home Office immigration litigation, because it gives you good exposure to some of the advocacy that is available within government. And I should say up front that advocacy opportunities in court are limited. It's not to say that they don't exist, but what I would encourage you to think about whenever you come to decide on where you want to apply is think truly about what areas of law interest you first and foremost. So for me, working within government, working in public law, and sort of advising on sort of government, on the legalities of government policy, and sort of working with legislation, all of that, all appealed to me before it came to the advocacy, which I enjoyed doing. But I think that it's a good thing to bear in mind, because it could be that courtroom advocacy is a deal breaker for you. It's something you want to do. The way I look at it is, I did have some opportunities for courtroom advocacy, which I can discuss if anyone's interested. But there are different types of advocacy involved, whether at perhaps a more senior level you're engaging with ministers, certainly you're engaging with clients and you're having to present legal arguments within the workplace and be prepared to take sort of challenging questions. But just I thought it was worth flagging at the outset about advocacy. And as I say, so during the pupillage year, all pupils tend to go to Home Office immigration litigation. We are then seconded and do 6 months of practice in self-employed barristers' chambers. So I was at Selborne Chambers, which is a commercial chancery set in the city, and it does work, I think, in some specialist property areas, landlord-tenant, commercial landlord-tenant sort of wills, estates, that sort of thing. So very different from what I had been doing for the first 6 months. And then after the pupillage year was completed and I finally qualified at the bar, I came back in-house. I was working as part of the Northern Ireland Protocol team for 6 months, which for those who are paying attention to my accent might recognize that carried a personal as well as professional interest for me. And then the final seat of my 2-year training program was with the Commercial Law Group, advising the Home Office. So since then, I've now come into DEFRA to work advising on some interesting matters concerning animal health, and so you'll appreciate that there are limits on what I can say day to day given the sensitivities of government. But it is worth noting that there are opportunities to move in government. It's at the very outset of your government career that is encouraged, but that's not to say that you can't specialize if it's something you would prefer to do whenever you see what works for you. What I would say is if you are interested in government, keep an open mind as well, because actually there's something interesting in everything I've done so far, even if the area wasn't something that I thought on paper was one that appealed at the outset. So that's a very brief overview, I hope, of GLD. Certainly was, well, you can determine whether this is more interesting to you if I reflect on my own circumstances. So I was called to the bar in 2013, and I had sort of a really difficult time finding pupillage. I should say at this point that accepting pupillage at the employed bar was not a compromise for me. As I said at the beginning, I was attracted to government because of the type of work and the nature of the environment. And I was applying for government pupillage for as long as I was applying to external sets of chambers as well. But I was called to the bar in 2013, and then because there was a wait before I secured pupillage in 2018 to start in 2020, I did a number of very interesting things in the interim. So I went back to Northern Ireland and took a role with Herbert Smith Freehills as a paralegal. At the same time, I was training for the New York bar, and I've subsequently been called as a New York attorney. And after that, after I passed that exam, I moved offices to the London office of Herbert Smith before winning a scholarship from my Inn of Court to go and work at the European Court of Human Rights for 3 months. So that was back in 2015. Whenever I returned from Strasbourg, I then took a role with Thomson Reuters Practical Law. So if we have people who are studying law programs at the minute, you might be familiar. If you're not familiar with Practical Law, you'll, I'm sure, be familiar with Westlaw. So I was working in an editorial capacity, covering the legal implications, covering legal developments and offering guidance in terms of dispute resolution, arbitration, and then latterly the legal implications of Brexit. So that then led me into government, as I say, in September 2020, and I've been there since. So and one of the things that I find that because of how difficult it was, I didn't realize you become a bit reflective over time, and an opportunity presented itself to get involved in speaking about social mobility for the bar, and I took that opportunity and was awarded a place as a Bar Council social mobility advocate. And it's something that I do think is very important, because throughout all of that time I had to reflect on why I hadn't got to where I wanted to go sooner. Perhaps you do start asking questions along the lines of, is it something to do that's inherent within me that I can't change? And now that I have a platform, it's something I think is important to speak about, because I do believe truly that no matter where you're from or whatever your background, your experiences inform your outlook. They inform your ability to do things or to look at things in a certain way that maybe isn't apparent to people who have perhaps come from a more traditional upbringing, let's say. And I think there is value to be had from that. In terms of memorable moments at the bar, bearing in mind what I've just said, is that the one that jumps to my mind straight away is simply whenever I finally got that phone call to say, we would like to offer you pupillage. And you might all be thinking, oh, how would you react whenever you sort of get all of that news? Are you going to be absolutely elated? Are you going to be sobbing? All of these sorts of things. To me, it was just this instant flood of relief, this thing that I had been working towards for so long, and yet seemingly hadn't found out how to break down that door. It was finally there for me, and it was just instant relief. In terms of sort of memorable moments within government, I should perhaps take the advice I would give as a New York attorney, which is to plead the fifth, especially sort of in the current climate where there are, I'm sure you'll appreciate, particular sensitivities. But it was professionally rewarding and personally rewarding to work on the Northern Ireland Protocol issue. So that's one thing that I would flag. And then just finally to wrap up, and provided we have time, I'm obviously happy to take any questions based on anything I've said or otherwise. Just some thoughts on succeeding at the employed bar, and to be quite honest, the bar more generally. The one thing I hope that people take from listening to me, whether it's in this sort of 5-10 minute slot, or if you meet me at a Lincoln's Inn or wherever you happen to be, is if you've taken anything from listening to me, it really is the importance of not giving up, persevering. And I think it's best just to leave it, that concise way, because you will hopefully get there if you persevere. The second thing I would say is to take every opportunity that comes your way, whether that's sort of at your stages, perhaps taking work experience opportunities that you don't think might benefit you, or just say yes to as many things as possible, because it will broaden your horizons and hopefully inform some of the decisions you want to make. And then finally, I think, a point that people might, very well lose sight of, especially in such a competitive profession, but I do think it's important to have a hinterland, enjoy those other things about your life, which are quite honestly more important than sort of your day-to-day work. And that's not to say that I don't feel immensely privileged, per choice of words, but it's not to say that I'm not incredibly grateful to be in the career and the profession, and that's not to say that I don't give it my all, but it's only one part of my personality. So I prefer not to say I am a barrister. I prefer to say I do barristering. And that, I think, is where I will leave it for the moment, but obviously very happy to take any questions, as I say.
Great, thank you. What a good note to end on. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. I thought some really interesting things there. Very evident that it's possible to move around a lot in the GLD, and obviously you have moved around and made the most of various opportunities. So I really hope people could see that, and that point about perseverance as well. You know, make those opportunities count. You know, obviously try and enjoy them as you do it, but make them sensible, good choices that, you know, make you more valuable later on, so that people can see the value. Because I agree with you that while things are getting better from a sort of social mobility point of view in particular, you know, the competition's so fierce, you've got to do your best to try and tell people why they should hire you or why they should give you that chance, and you know, all of that stuff really helps for that. So thank you very much for that. Handing over to Alex now, please. Same 3 points for you: your journey, your day-to-day, and your memorable moment, please.
You know, I think I'm quite pleased where I am in this running order, because I think one thing that I hope you've taken away from what the people have said so far is how much variety there is at the employed bar. And I think my journey really emphasises that. And I echo a lot of what Jack says and a lot of what Ryan has said, because, golly, perhaps one of the things you'll take away from my story is that I'm now feeling really old. But my career is almost 50-50 in the public and the private sector, and I have loved the variety I've been able to have in my career to date. I was called to the bar way back in 1997, and I was in a set of chambers that did a lot of government work. And it just so happened that the then Treasury Solicitors Department needed a young barrister who could help out with some employment law cases. And I ended up going to help the Treasury Solicitors Department in 1999. And I found myself staying in what was then the Government Legal Service, but as Jack knows, is now the Government Legal Department until 2012. And the reason I stayed was purely for the variety. I did a couple of years doing employment law litigation, and I litigated in the employment tribunals all the way up to the then House of Lords, now the Supreme Court. I worked for a huge range of government departments, but did a lot with the Ministry of Defence and the Prison Service. And what was fascinating about the job was that often the points you're litigating are novel points of law. So that's interesting in itself. You're lawyers because you like the law. So having the opportunity to stand up in court and make new points of law is a fantastic opportunity. But you also learn about new clients, new environments. And I loved that learning experience. So I could learn about the law, but learn about how the prison service worked, how the Ministry of Defence worked. And I went from what we'd call private law litigation, employment, to public law litigation. And I started doing judicial reviews. Again, I've probably specialised mainly in the prison service and a little bit in the Ministry of Defence. So my speciality was juveniles in prison, mothers and babies in prison, and also what to do with transgender prisoners. So absolutely fascinating points from a social justice point of view, as well as the law. I enjoyed that, but as Jack said, one of the beauties of being in the Government Legal Service is you can keep moving. So I went from there to the Ministry of Defence, completely different. I was actually working as an advisory as a lawyer as opposed to a litigator, and incredible experiences again. One of the things I was doing was the end of the military presence in Northern Ireland. Again, something Jack will remember. And I spent time in barracks in Northern Ireland working on that and really being embedded with the military to understand what it meant to them and what we're going to do with all these soldiers who'd spent their life in the military in Northern Ireland. An absolutely fascinating opportunity to look at the political and social environment as well as the legal environment. And what I was doing in government was collecting tools for my toolkit. I really believe that an important facet of being a lawyer is your skills. With good skills, you can gain experience. So I'd done private law litigation, I'd done public law litigation, I'd advised the Ministry of Defence. What I hadn't done was EU law. So off I went to the Treasury, not for financial services at the time, but because I wanted to be negotiating in Brussels. And I spent, gosh, 2007 to 2012 at the Treasury, and I was probably 4 days a week in Brussels on various EU member states negotiating points of law. Absolutely loved it. I negotiated the law in Brussels, brought it back to the UK and implemented it. And I actually fell for financial services at the time. I said what I enjoy is variety, but that means I enjoy learning as well. And what I found from financial services, the point that Ryan's made, it's a fascinating area, not just of the law, but of business. And it's where law and politics and business and economics all intersect. And I found myself really enjoying learning about how the financial services sector worked. So that's when I decided to specialise back in 2012, 10 years ago. And that's when I left the government legal service to see how the other half lived. So I went to work for an American law firm, advising the financial institutions whose law I'd been negotiating and drafting. I had a couple of years there. And what often happens in law firms, you get a secondment to a big client. I got seconded to HSBC, and I ended up staying at HSBC from 2016 till 2022. And as Dan has said, I was a Deputy General Counsel there and headed up, first of all, a wealth management function that basically gives investment advice to not the super rich, that's where you go to private banks, but certainly the very well off. I headed up the global business for HSBC there, and then I started heading up a change function. And what it made me realise is throughout my career, I have got a USP. I've always worked in change. It might be the law that's changing, it might be facts that's changing, but I've always worked in change. But I left there in 2022. And I'm doing something different again. I am still a financial services consultant, Dan, and I've got at the moment 3 different consultancies. So I'm working with 2 law firms, one a big city law firm, Simmons & Simmons. I'm also working with a bespoke startup law firm called Punter Southall, and I've also got a contract with an international bank in France that I'm supporting them in an operational change contract. An operational change project. So I've pulled all the experience I've had in the last 20 odd years together to create a new role for myself, and it's exciting. So what are my memorable moments? Golly, I've got loads, but lots of them about meeting people, different experiences, about being in helicopters with the commander of a helicopter force and working with them on Salisbury Plain before they're deployed to Afghanistan. I drove a tank. I was in barracks in Northern Ireland. Implementing law for HSBC meant travelling around the world to all the HSBC officers and explaining what UK law does and how it impacts them, learning about what they did. And that's what I think I enjoy about being an employed barrister, the constant learning. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, what would my tips be? Always think about why you want to do something and really sell why you want this particular job. Sell about why you'll be good at that job. Talk about the skills you bring. You don't have to have legal experience. Lots of the work you've done at law school, those jobs you might have had in the summer holidays, you've got experiences and skills from there. Talk about them, use them. And other people have said, be confident, you have got something to offer, and say that confidently. Right, I'll stop there because I'm conscious of time.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, don't worry, we'll keep Patrick to time. That's how I'll deal with this. That was very interesting. Thank you. No, really fascinating. Again, to hear that moving around, the variety I liked your collecting tools for the toolkit. You know, every opportunity is a chance to skill up and to take something forward. So that's really interesting. And the fact that you can see a thread in your career, which is your USP, which is sort of interesting how that comes out. So thank you very much for that. Handing over to Patrick now, please. Hopefully we'll have 5 minutes at the end for questions. There's a couple of questions in the chat box, which I think probably can be relatively quickly answered. But Patrick, if you don't mind trying to keep it to 10 minutes, then we'll hopefully have time for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'll hopefully keep it under the 10-minute mark. I think my history is probably of even more aged antiquity than Alex's. I think I was called to the bar a number of years earlier than that. I sort of accidentally fell into the bar. I'm part of the Northern Irish posse, which is on the line this evening. So I had no family or friends with any legal connections at all. But as I was an argumentative soul at school, I thought the bar sounded as if it might be the place for me. And then after going to university and having seen my friends do work experience at law firms and were sort of working late until about midnight, that frightened the daylights out of me. So I thought actually being an independent barrister with me managing my own workload and career was likely to be more in my sort of strong suit rather than being told what to do by an employer. So that's how I ended up going to the criminal bar and was there for about 13 years working in chambers. And then I moved across pretty much every aspect of where you can be a barrister. So I worked in government in the Serious Fraud Office. So from moving around in the criminal courts and doing a lot of courtroom work, be that in the Magistrates Court, the Crown Court, the High Court, or the Court of Appeal for criminal sides of things, I then moved into a government setting and took obviously a large pay cut to move across to government because they don't pay fantastically well in comparison to the private bar. But it was incredibly enjoyable work, and now I'm an advocacy trainer for the Inns of Court. And actually, of the people that I see that are coming through the sort of criminal bar chambers route and those who have had experience within government legal departments, I actually find that those trained within the government legal departments just get so much more responsibility at such an earlier stage, and that they're actually very bloody hard working. No disrespect to barristers working in chambers, but I think the quality of their advocacy ends up being outstandingly good. And certainly when I was working in government, there's a broad range of people within government, from the incredibly talented to the considerably less so. And it's managing all of those resources ends up being sort of interesting challenges. So I sort of moved from dealing with largely high street criminals and general fraudsters and hucksters doing prosecution and defense work, and then went across and worked in government in really big corporate fraud cases and bribery and corruption cases. And whilst I was there, I made sure that I got involved in a project to change the law. It was around the time of the Bribery Act coming in, the guidance in relation to how the Bribery Act should be applied, and then I got involved with drafting legislation in terms of deferred prosecution agreements. And as Alex has said, as well as Jack, in terms of working, across government, you get to see fantastic different things. So that was a great thing to see how legislation was drafted, getting involved with it, and then effectively at the end of that period, I thought, well, actually, I've created this statute. Now it's time really to put it into practice. That's when I transferred across to become a partner in a law firm. So although I'm not a solicitor, the rules changed about a decade or more ago, whereby partners could become managers, or barristers could become managers in law firms. So I went across and became a partner in a law firm, and I've been doing effectively the same work ever since, in terms of representing corporates on the other side of the table, effectively to the Serious Fraud Office, and it's big investigations by the Department of Justice, by the UK SFO, by the World Bank, and by other agencies. My practice is very international, so I'm working at the minute in an investigation in Italy involving the mafia taking over one of our companies and charging extortionate rates, to another one in France where my individual has been named in French proceedings in relation to a bribery and corruption settlement, and he's trying to challenge that, to a matter with the Inter-American Development Bank, which is a bank that deals with loaning monies in the Latin American area. So it's very wide-ranging practice. It's incredibly interesting. But again, the key thing which ties it all together is it's all related effectively to where I started in terms of crime. And during that time, you can keep as little or as much contact with the bar as you want, because there's things like the Inns of Court, which are a great place to network. I'm a bencher at Gray's Inn. I also do advocacy training with the Inns of Court as well, and then events like these with an organisation like BACFI. It's a Bar Association of Commerce, Finance and Industry. So as a result, we have quite a wide membership. So the key things which I'd take away from my career is just make sure you keep a little black book with all of your contacts in it, and make sure you stay in contact with them, because you'll eventually come across them again at some stage in the future. Also, it's worthwhile keeping in contact with different people, and over the weekend, I'm going off to Pembroke, my old college, which Ryan was at, I believe, many years ago as well. So I'm going up there to do a talk to students up there as well. So I think it's very good to keep in contact with those at university that you're with, those in terms of bar school or law school, wherever you end up going to, because you will inevitably go full circle at some stage, and just take all the opportunities that come your way. I managed to get a pupillage by pure dumbass luck, as I was sitting complaining about how one place had refused to interview me, whilst the person sat across from me at the dinner hall at Gray's Inn said, "Oh, well, bizarrely, I'm just about to turn them down because I accepted 2 pupillages." So I rang them up the next day and said, "By the way, look, if you've got any potential spaces left for an interview, I am still available. I would still love to be interviewed by you." So it was just pure luck that they then said, "Okay, well, funny enough, there is a space. Why don't you come in for an interview?" So that was just luck, and again, perseverance. So the reality is with any career in law, be it as a solicitor, as a barrister, employed barrister, or in chambers as an independent barrister, the reality is it takes a lot of hard work, and you just need to continue at it, and not give up, and just go down whichever avenue you think best, and then just keep away plugging at it, and just to enjoy the variety of things that are out there, and certainly don't give up in terms of government practice. Government practice, I think, gives you a huge opportunity, and you can apply across different areas within government. So once you're in government, once I was within the SFO, I applied just for interview practice, frankly, to the MI5, MI6's security service jobs. I applied to the Attorney General's office. I applied to the National Fraud Authority, which was a government department way back in those days, and it was a great interview experience. I got a couple of other job offers out of them. I ended up not going for them in the end, but it's just a great place to try out lots of different things and get great experiences. So ultimately, the key takeaway from the end of this is just make sure you keep your network as wide as possible, keep in contact with as many people as possible, explore as many opportunities as you can. And it's the story of Brenda Hale, Lady Hale, who became president of the Supreme Court, who effectively started off as a barrister, went into effectively academia, and then moved back from academia, and then went through various judicial positions, and essentially worked her way up from the bottom to the top, and became president of the first female president of the Supreme Court. I think that should be a glowing example to to anybody starting off in the profession, that it doesn't matter where you come from. I think she comes from Yorkshire, which is some heavily working class area across the country, and she has made her way to where she is now. So I think there is a land of opportunity out there. Just make sure you get up and go for it. So I think I'm within my 10 minutes there. So I'll hand over to Dan and open it up to questions.
Very good, thank you. You've even got a minute spare if you needed it. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I think really underlines the point about this ability to move around, transfer, taking opportunities as you go. And I think the point I took from that was just the real number of ways there are to skin a cat. If you don't make the first move that you make, if it doesn't come off for you, isn't the end of the story. There's different ways to do it. And I often give similar advice to people. I mentor some students sometimes of the University of Portsmouth, actually, and sometimes the advice I give is that you may be eminently suitable, but sometimes those organizations don't have the structures to see that. And that is one of the problems, that some of this stuff isn't within your control. The way to make them see it is to be able to show experience, and to get that experience, you may have to go somewhere which wouldn't be your first choice. And I think that's what you were sort of alluding to there, Patrick, about how you get in, you do the time, you show what you can do, you then use that to leverage to the next position, and then ultimately it becomes a free choice, like you said. So I think that's very helpful advice. So
well,
yes,
and I think also just chiming in on that point, I think the reality is, and Alex has said it in the chat room there, just do anything that's even vaguely legal. If you don't get the job that you're looking for, go out there, go to Citizens Advice, go out there and apply for paralegal positions.
Yes, yes.
Go out there and do things which are, you can apply to be, a part-time judge in a parking tribunal, which needs zero legal qualifications, but it gives you legal experience, and it's open to members of the public to apply for these things. So just get as much experience as you can, and then use it to your advantage later.
Completely. I think transferable skills as well. Sorry, go on.
Exactly. And yes, ideally legal experience is great, but lots of firms now interview on the basis of competencies, and competencies are your ability to work well as part of a team, analytical skills, judgment skills. You can
problem solving, all of that.
Exactly, and you can use non-legal experience to demonstrate that you have those competencies. I used to interview for the government legal department. I would say 50-50. Oh, that's probably telling us we're finished, isn't it? I would say 50-50 people had a legal background and a non-legal background. And there was no difference in which ones eventually ended up in
exactly, but it's about how you can develop those skills and then demonstrate them. I think that's sometimes a difficulty, because if you're, I've seen it from various places where you can't even make the cut on paper, so you don't get a chance to show anything, and that's very sad. So there's different things that need to be done. I just wanted to pick up on Alice's question, because it wasn't answered in the chat. It was just, she asked, is there any difference in the GLD between solicitor and barrister training and subsequent work? And I think the answer to that is no. The GLD is the academic stage, common to both streams. It's after that things diverge a bit and you make your choices. But I think, as we've demonstrated, those choices are not necessarily fixed. Solicitors can do higher rights of audience training if they want to do oral advocacy. Barristers can do conduct of litigation training if they want to be like a solicitor. So just encourage people to sort of understand that there is quite a lot of flexibility. Right. Did we have any other questions?
Sorry, Dan, was that a question on? Sorry, was that a question on the GLD as a government legal, or GGL?
Oh, sorry.
It's only for some reason I can't see the chat.
Sorry, no, that was my mistake.
I think it's GLD, and I think the answer is that the government legal department generally offers solicitor training contracts. It's the CPS, I think, which is one of the few organisations out there which actually offers a barrister training route as well as I think the GLD, am I right, Janet?
No, GLD also. Sorry, just GLD offers pupillage as well, so that's the route that I've come through.
Right. I thought but it's predominantly solicitor route, isn't it?
I'd say there's about 40 trainees a year, and sort of between 4 and 6 of those are pupil barristers. And there's a slight difference in the training, in the sense it's split into a litigation year and an advisory year for everybody, and that's sort of the unique selling point of government. So advisory, where you're sitting within government departments and advising on policy from the legal side. The difference between the barrister and solicitor training is that the pupillage year is split into sort of your 6 months doing immigration litigation, and then 6 months seconded to a set of barristers' chambers, and then there are different regulatory requirements along the way as well, which GLD is sort of very good at keeping everyone up to date with whoever needs to know what. So obviously the BSB will have different requirements in the SRA. So there are subtle differences. And one thing that I did mean to say earlier on was that with GLD, you very rarely hear people day to day referring to themselves either as barrister, solicitor. We are all being trained as government lawyers. But from my point of view, I think it is important to flag that there are bar opportunities there, because I think sometimes it gets overlooked.
And just to echo everything that Jack said, I was actually a pupil mistress in the government legal service, but I also supervised solicitor trainees as well. I don't think the government legal department distinguishes, but I do think people might run their caseloads differently. So because I came from the self-employed bar and was used to being in court, I would do a lot of my own advocacy. I would do a lot of my own drafting of pleadings. I would do a lot of my own witness prepping. I found that not everybody did that, and people used the skills they had in different ways, and the government legal department is open to that. You run your cases as is best for you, and of course as best for them as well. But if you're able to manage your caseload by doing your own drafting, by doing your own advocacy, then we're very happy to let you do that.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, certainly I know that having trained as a barrister informs the way I analyze things. It informs the way I set out advice, and obviously there are certain ways, as with every employer, certain ways of doing things that everybody likes. But I do think that your training, and it's made clear, sort of all of our email signatures, they'll say government lawyer, but also sort of beside that it will specify what, in what capacity, whether we're at the bar, whether we're solicitors, we'll have foreign qualified lawyers as well. And so that's the way I think about things day to day. And yeah,
no, that's brilliant. Thank you. I was just wondering if there's time for, maybe if somebody wants to come on camera and ask a question, we might have time for one more question, just to make sure everyone's had a chance. I know there's been quite a lot of writing in the chat, which everyone can benefit from reading. But if anyone's got any other questions, we can take that now. Give it a couple more seconds. No. Okay. That probably does mean that we're at the end. Thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to us, and for the questions that were asked. And thank you very much for City for hosting us, and perhaps if I pass back to Fionn just to wrap up.
Thank you very much, everybody. That really was a fascinating evening, and I certainly learn something every time this event is undertaken. And what's really refreshing is just how positive everybody is about what they're doing and how exciting their lives are. I can actually see there is a little question here from Johan. I don't know, Johan, if you want to quickly pop your mic on. We did say we'd have room for one question. If everybody needs to go, then if any of our panelists need to go, then please do so. Johan, do you want to put your microphone on?
Yes, I think it's on.
Please do ask your question.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much to everyone. I think that was one of the most inspiring things I've heard, is every single one of the panelists sharing their experiences. And it's very interesting, because it almost, I feel more in touch now with the barrister's profession because of it. Because I think that coming from a corporate background, more on the business side, myself, I haven't been able to relate to much of the traditional way in which barristers sort of become barristers. It's like usually it's the bar training course, and then pupillage, and then getting tenancy. And that's the standard route, which we're sort of just told, and that's how usually it happens. But I haven't heard much about how people sort of from other professions can come in, and even throughout, it's like, especially for example, Janet's story was very inspiring to me, because it's like the rejection part, and just dealing with that rejection, it really, and just soldiering on despite it, and finding other ways, as Alexandra has also mentioned, and as Jack and Patrick and Ryan have shown. It's like it is the only thing that I want to ask, though, is like, for example, when we're sort of selling ourselves, obviously we want to not talk about things which are irrelevant to the position, But let's say we do have a few years of corporate business, for example, under our belts, solving problems in that kind of world. Would any of that be relevant to applying for positions in a bank, or perhaps in a commercial set, or wherever we end up going? As one thing which I have taken away from this talk is to cast the net wide and to grab any and all opportunities that come by. And that's my question, actually.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'll jump in and perhaps just answer and see if anyone else has anything to add to it. But I think my answer would be that, yes, it's relevant, and it's probably relevant to anything that you're seeking to do, because there will be elements of, practical problem solving, teamwork, I don't know, presentation, customer facing, whatever it is, you'll find something in that to mine as a relevant experience to refer to. So I think absolutely draw on that, and obviously it's a matter of drawing it out and presenting it, but I think there'll absolutely be a goldmine of things there. So I don't know if anyone else.
Yes, may I just comment as well? I think having worked in a corporate sort of scenario for many years before, many of the skills that I learned were transferable skills. And what you have to do when you're making an application, what you really have to do is think about what the agency or the company does that you're applying to, and you need to be able to hook your skills. Use it as the analogy is a clothes hook, and hook your skills onto that company or that agency and relate the skills that you have to what they do. Because as I said earlier, really it's a personality and skills match. That's what an interview will be. So that would be my response to that question, Johan.
I mean, if I could add two very brief thoughts that I sort of proffer as advice to people whenever they're coming to selling themselves. First thing I say was a useful piece of advice that I got along the way, because I had this sort of different opportunities and experiences. And if whenever you are presenting your application or you're sort of interviewing, I think that if you can sort of show that there's a logical through line to everything that you've done. So whenever you're putting it on paper, I don't like to use phrases like your story and stuff like that, but if it's like you're crafting a narrative so that by the time you have come to interview with this place, you can sort of demonstrate or have an answer prepared for why every decision you've taken thus far, even if you didn't think about it at the time, has logically led you to this point. So that's the first thing that I would say, if that's a helpful way of looking at it. The second thing that I say to students quite a lot as well is, if you think about yourself as your own client, we are all hired or sort of employed to advocate or represent people and put forward their interests. So if you imagine that you're actually on the other side of that, what would you be asking your lawyer to do on your behalf? And it's about selling yourself. So if you sort of almost have this out of body experience and disassociate yourself, you as the applicant and you as your own representative, your own advocates, perhaps that's a way of thinking about it as well, as how can I do the best thing for myself as I would do for another person that needs my help.
I'll just add a few points, Johan. I think it's actually very valuable if you've had time in a corporate environment and you're seeking pupillage. As you pointed out, many barristers have gone through a very traditional route of university, pupillage and tenancy, and yet their clients are solicitors' firms, which is quite a corporate environment, and the solicitors' firms' clients are often companies and corporations. Your experience of how decisions are made in a corporate environment, I think, is interesting to chambers and barristers, and that insight that you could bring to them is potentially valuable. I think it's a selling point. That's a strong point if you've had previous corporate experience.
Thank you very much to everyone.
Great.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you. And thanks very much to our panel. I think there's they've given a lot of food for thought for students, and we've got the membership details at the school if anybody needs to seek those further, and the information about the up and coming lecture. So really thank you very much for coming, and for sharing your time and for sharing your anecdotes and your journeys, and most importantly for the students, your tips on how to navigate this this stage in their careers. And I think going back to something that Janet said, is that, you know, if you do persevere, you will succeed. You may take the scenic route. I'm not quoting. I'm ad-libbing, but many people take the scenic route, and that is a route with many benefits along the way. So just remember how, and I think Jack, you know, had a bit of a recall of how stressful the whole thing was and is, and we know that, we understand how stressful this is, but just remember that to try and smell the roses along the way, because it's your life, and I think that's what people are saying. You're still living your life. You need to do that along this route, but you will get there. And if you have to take the scenic route, take it, because sometimes it's lovely.
Great, thank you very much. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good luck, everyone, and do reach out for BACFI or for any of us on LinkedIn and so on if you want to increase your network. But good luck with it all.
Good luck, everybody.
All the best.
Enjoy it.
And thank
Bye-bye.
you to Sandra for organising. Thank you, Sandra.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandra.
Bye.